Helps to have it on, I guess. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, good evening. Welcome. Welcome to week 3 of the Quest series here at Concordia Seminary featuring Dr. Heck on C.S. Lewis. You know that Quest series is one of the ways in which we reach out to the congregations and also to the pastors, to laity, to help them in their witness, in the witness of the gospel. And you know that the main work of, the heart of the work of CLS is to train pastors and deacons for the ministry of word and sacraments. So if you are somebody who is watching this online or a recorded video of this later, or somebody who is interested in the pastoral ministry or deacon ministry, I think we have great news for you, and Dr. Vieira is someone who is interested to talk to you, so I really encourage you to reach out to him. And we also do have, if you are looking to test the waters to see how seminary is looking like, you can talk to Dr. Heck or me, or you can get in touch with Dr. Jen Frim, who is academic dean. She might invite you to sit in a few classes, or even offer a course to audit, or even some students can, if they are interested, they can do some courses as open study students also. So these are some of the opportunities for you. Today, let me come back to today's session and for the purpose we are here. Today, when I walked into Dr. Heck's office, I found 2 Chinese books. And then I asked him, "Do you read Chinese?" And I think maybe, no. So I was curious how these 2 books ended up there. And then he started telling me the story. Somebody was searching for a C.S. Lewis scholar who is known worldwide and who is expert. And 2 Chinese friends reached out to him because they were impressed with the work of C.S. Lewis, and they want to translate this work to Chinese. And they sought the help of Dr. Heck, and they were able to get these works done in Chinese. So these are some of the work they did, and in appreciation to Dr. Heck's contribution, scholarly contribution towards their translation process, they mailed these 2 books to him. So Dr. Heck is not just known here in North America. So that is something exciting, and we are so excited to have him. And tonight I understand that he's going to present on 2 books, especially 2 works of C.S. Lewis, which is well-known, Screwtape letters, and also Mere Christianity. And I'm so excited, and I'm looking forward to hear from him. And I don't want to take any more time, but I just want to welcome Dr. Heck in our midst and to do the presentation for us. Welcome, Dr. Heck.
Thank you. Thank you. We are very much supported by the Friends of the Seminary, but the best contribution you could ever make is to send a student our way. I know some of you actually have sent students our way because I know a little bit about those personal stories. But one of the reasons why this is a good place to study is because the cost of seminary education has been defrayed by so many of our donors. Well over half of our operating budget every year is the results of contributions of generous people like you. Again, the most generous thing you can do is to send us a student, but typically students who enroll at Concordia Lutheran Seminary do not leave the seminary after graduation with any more debt than they came in with. And it's because of the generosity of so many people, some of them you and many of them out there in the church. So we appreciate that, and thank you if you're one of our supporters, and by prayer, by finances, by recruitment. We appreciate all that very much. So thank you for being here this evening. Let's get into the Screwtape letters, a book dedicated to J.R. Tolkien. You've heard of that guy, I suspect. So The Screwtape letters, where did they come from? They are the reason why Lewis's picture was on the cover of Time magazine in 1947. His description of the book is Ethics Served with an Imaginative Seasoning. My description is it's letters from a senior devil to a junior devil on the art of temptation, or I could subtitle it, How to Drag a Human Being to Hell. It's all about temptation from the dark side. And by the way, the handout that I have for you this evening is something I wrote a few years ago. I read the Screwtape letters again, just looking for plot lines, characters in the story, apart from Screwtape, the senior devil, and Wormwood, the junior devil. Who is this person that is being tempted by Wormwood, and how successful is he, and what happens during this person's life? And that is a one-page summary of the plot behind the story of the Screwtape letters. They are 31 letters on the art of temptation. When Lewis was speaking at King's College at the University of London at, I think, one of their commencement exercises in December, he made this comment in the light of his reputation already with Screwtape letters, which had been published in 1942. He said, "The devil I shall leave strictly alone. The association between him and me in the public mind has already gone quite as deep as I wish." This is appropriate time to laugh if you want to, or chuckle, or at least smile, whether you're online or here in person. So he also makes this comment about listening in on a radio to Adolf Hitler, actually. He says, "I don't know if I'm weaker than other people, but it is a positive revelation to me how while the speech lasts, it is impossible not to waver just a little. I should be useless as a schoolmaster or a policeman. Statements which I know to be untrue all but convince me, at any rate for the moment, if only the man says them unflinchingly." So this gives you a little bit of an awareness of the proverb that says that whoever thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall, because temptation is something that we're all susceptible to, especially when we only hear one side of the story. So where did this book come from? He read Letters from Hell by a Danish author whose name is listed there. That may have given him the idea for the Screwtape letters, although none of the content. He himself attributed the idea for the book to Confessions of a Well-Meaning Woman by Stephen McKenna. It's a book that he said made all blacks white and all whites black, so really flipped things on its head. And so in 1940, this is during the Second World War, Lewis is at home, Warney is in the military service, helping out with the Royal Army Service Corps, which deals with the supply side of the Army. And he says, and he's in a worship service, and he gets an idea for a book. Now, I don't know what it is about C.S. Lewis, but it seems like he got a lot of his best ideas during his, maybe the sermons were so good, they were food for thought and got him thinking. But this is what he wrote to his brother about that service, that worship service. "Before the service was over, one could wish these things came more seasonably." I guess he felt guilty that he wasn't paying attention to the preacher. "I was struck by an idea for a book which I think might be both useful and entertaining. It would be called As One Devil to Another, and would consist of letters from an elderly retired devil to a young devil who has just started work on his first patient. The idea would be to give all the psychology of temptation from the other point of view. For example, about undermining his faith in prayer, I don't think you need have any difficulty with his intellect, provided you never say the wrong thing at the wrong moment. After all, the enemy will either answer the enemy is God, from Screwtape's point of view. The enemy will answer his prayer or not. If he does not, then that's simple. It shows prayers are no good. If he does, I've always found that, oddly enough, that this can just as easily be utilized. It needs only a word from you to make him believe that the very fact of feeling more patient after he's prayed for patience will be taken as proof that prayer is a kind of self-hypnosis. Or if it is answered by some external event, then since that event will have causes which you can point to, he can be persuaded that it would have happened anyway. You see the idea, he says to Warren, prayer can always be discredited either because it works or because it doesn't. Well, these 31 letters were serialized, one a week, in The Guardian, a Church of England publication at that time. And the first title, as you heard from Lewis's letter, From One Devil to Another, or As One Devil to Another. That was his first idea for a title of the book. He once said of David Lindsay's use of names in a piece of science fiction that Lindsay wrote that perhaps Screwtape owes something to them. Made a few bucks, about $1,500 in US coin at that time in 1942. The royalties, however, went to an agape fund that he set up with the help of a friend who was a lawyer to help the poor, particularly clergy widows. So he's a very generous man throughout his lifetime. He had a decent salary at Oxford University, as you can imagine, so he set up this fund to put the royalties of his books into. He was discovered by Ashley Sampson, who read some of the letters and talked to his friend and publisher, Jeffrey Bless, and said that they needed to buy the rights for the book, which they did. And so the book was then published in 1942. But like Mere Christianity and like the Chronicles of Narnia, this book was conceived during World War II and brought to publication during the Second World War. And so three major works of Lewis, probably his most influential book, Mere Christianity, that we'll look at in the second hour. This book, the Screwtape Letters and the Chronicles of Narnia, were all conceived in the mind of Lewis during wartime, connected to wartime. It's been so popular that since it was first published in 1942, that other people decided to try to imitate it and have come up with some more modern versions of it. First edition was sold out before publication. More than 2 million copies since, although it's really hard to know how many copies of this book have been printed, published, and sold, because publishers don't want you to know how many copies they're publishing, how much money they're making off of the book, so they just don't give out that kind of information. Still on Publishers Weekly top 10 list of religious paperback bestsellers. It's now on audio CD. It's been copied by Peter Kraft in the Snakebite Letters, a little bit of an echo of Screwtape. Randy Alcorn wrote a book called Lord Falgren's Letters. Both of them write longer letters than Lewis did, so they weren't as concise as he was. And there are several others. Andrew Farley in 2013, Steve Deese in 2016, Elton Higgs in 2021. So there are at least 5 imitations of the Screwtape Letters because the book was so popular. Anybody have any idea which version I think is the best of the lot? And even so popular as to be turned into a comic book. I forget what I paid for this some years ago, but I bet it's $40, $50 to $100 in US or Canadian currency. So allegedly, the movie rights were bought in 2006. Let's see, that's 18 years ago. I'm gotta guess that this is never going to be turned into a feature film, even though that was the intent. Some of you know that Max McLean has performed the Screwtape Letters, not every letter memorized, but some of them, and he does really quite well as a one-man play. But I don't think it will be actually ever brought onto the screen, because it's 18 years and we're still waiting to hear if Walden Media is going to do something, which is probably not. So, how's your Latin? Sometimes people who have accomplished great things in their lives get honorary degrees. So one reader said that since Screwtape did not hold a degree higher than a BS, Bachelor of Science, recommended that he get a doctorate in, well, here's the translation of it, into the degree of Doctor of Satanism in the cause of dishonor. Rather than honoris causa, in the cause of honor, it would, because it's Screwtape, it would have to be in the cause of dishonor. So this, and here's another touch of humor. Anybody ever watch or read the Calvin and Hobbes cartoons? There is a first grade teacher by the name of Miss Wormwood. How about that? U2, the Irish rock band from Dublin, Ireland, with those guys in it, have an animated video, Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me, and during that video, a copy of the Screwtape letter. I bet you didn't know this. Now, have I made your day or what? Screwtape letter is seen falling from Bono's hand. Bono, I guess it is. And Bono is a Christian from everything. Is he still alive? It's been a while. Yeah. There was a sequel to the Screwtape letters. I got a copy of it if you're interested. I don't know if it shows up in that book or not, but he had been frequently asked if he would write a sequel to it, and he finally did write an essay, set the scene in hell at the annual dinner of the Temperatures Training College for Young Devils. I bet you didn't know they had that going on there annually, did you? And so a Saturday Evening Post published it, and the guest speaker for this dinner is Dr. Slubgob, which is a good name for a demon if you ask me. So that's a classic essay, really worth your reading time if you decide to pick it up. Or you want to read it, send me an email and I'll send you a copy of it. So Lewis had a warning, a caveat, and he said it was distasteful to write. So why do you think that's the case? He'll tell us in his introduction to the Screwtape letters in just a little bit. Here's what he says about it in his Screwtape Proposes a Toast. I was often asked or advised to add to the original Screwtape letters, but for many years I felt not the least inclination to do it. Though I had never written anything more easily, I never wrote with less enjoyment. The ease came no doubt from the fact that the device of diabolical letters, once you thought of it, exploits itself spontaneously. It would run away with you for 1,000 pages if you gave it its head. But though it was easier to twist one's mind into the diabolical attitude, it says something about our human sinful nature, it was not fun or not for long. The strain produced a sort of spiritual cramp. The world into which I had to project myself while I spoke through Screwtape was all dust, grit, thirst, and itch. Every trace of beauty, freshness, and geniality had to be excluded. It almost smothered me before I was done. It would have smothered my readers if I had prolonged it. I had, moreover, a sort of grudge against my book for not being a different book, which no one could write. Ideally, Screwtape's advice to Wormwood should have been balanced by archangelical advice to the patient's guardian angel. Without this, the picture of human life is lopsided, but who could supply the deficiency? Even if a man, and he'd have to be a far better man than I, could scale the spiritual heights required to write this lofty, ideal prose, what answerable style could he use? I had thought of having, this is in a letter to Harry Blammers, I had thought of having letters to the guardian angel from an archangel side by side with those from Screwtape to Wormwood in my letters, but funked it. Lewis being very honest. So he goes on, the style would really be part of the content. Mere advice would be no good. Every sentence would have to smell of heaven. And nowadays, even if you could write prose like Treherne's, you wouldn't be allowed to, for the canon of functionalism in English literature has disabled literature for half its functions. At bottom, every ideal of style dictates not only how we should say things, but what sort of things we may say. Then, as the years went on and the stifling experience of writing the letters became a weaker memory, reflections on this and that which seemed somehow to demand Screwtapian treatment began to occur to me. I was resolved never to write another letter. The idea of something like a lecture or address hovered vaguely in my mind, now forgotten, now recalled, never written. Then came an invitation from the Saturday Evening Post, and that pressed the trigger. Now you're all excited to read that essay, and I'm not going to let you read it. I should have brought copies of it tonight. I could print it out, but I didn't. Maybe I roused enough curiosity. Some versions of the Screwtape letters are published with this added to it, so maybe you've already got that essay. So this is Lewis writing before he offers us the preface to the Screwtape letters, he quotes Martin Luther, which I kind of like. The best way to drive out the devil, he says, if you will not yield to text of Scripture, is to jeer and flout him, for he cannot bear scorn. And then he quotes Thomas More. The devil, the proud spirit, cannot endure to be mocked. So why these two guys? Why do you think these two guys? One Lutheran, one Catholic, 16th century contemporaries. And the topic is the same, right? To mock or scorn the devil, and so that's what Lewis was doing. In addition to writing the plot of the Screwtape letters, if you're at all interested, that handout should be up on our website, available to be downloaded. I also have read the Screwtape letters to develop a Screwtape vocabulary. So I think this is kind of cool. I underlined the most important ones. The enemy is God. You know, if you're Satan or you're Screwtape and writing about temptation, the enemy, who else could be the enemy but God? Satan is our father below, you know, instead of our Father who art in heaven. Okay. The opposite of hierarchy is lowerarchy. I've never used that word in my life except seen it used here. Heaven is a temple of fame, hell is a kingdom of noise, and there are a few other little bits and pieces here that help us to understand the book as we read it, in case you want to actually understand it. The danger with that is something that Derek pointed out to me before we got started, and that is that Lewis seems to peer into our soul and know how we think and how we are susceptible to temptation, almost as though he knew us, and he's been gone for well over 50 years. Ah. So part of the genius of Lewis's writing ability. So in a 1960 letter to Jocelyn Gibb, his publisher, Lewis wrote about the American edition of the Screwtape letters. He said, in the legend, under his drawing of Screwtape, I don't care for Mr. after excellency. If this can be altered without technical difficulties, as Screwtape signs a letter, his infernal excellency under Secretary Screwtape, would that be better? Or his abysmal sublimity, as at the end of letter 22. He kind of got into this a little bit, had a great sense of humor. He once said that there's no sound that I enjoy more in life than the sound of male laughter. He liked to get together with his buddies at the Eagle and Child or the Lamb and Flag, drink beer, read works that we were in the process of writing, and debate with one another. I'm wondering if, and I'm thinking that parts of this book is autobiographical. So for instance, I was showing you pictures of Janie King Moore, his stepmom, the mother of Patty Moore. Patty died in World War I, and Lewis kept a promise to take care of Patty's mother if he got back and Patty didn't. Likewise, Patty had promised to take care of Jack's mother or his father, because his mother had died, if Patty made it back and Jack didn't. So Mrs. Moore was an atheist, at least allegedly an atheist. I think there's some doubt about that. She seemed to resent Lewis's conversion. Letter 3, Lewis says, through the mouth of Screwtape to Wormwood, finally tell me something about the old lady's religious position. Is she at all jealous of the new factor in her son's life? So the patient, John, becomes a Christian early on in the storyline behind the Screwtape letters. Likewise, the patient's activities on home patrol during the war at night to watch out for Nazi bombers. Lewis did the same thing for the city of Oxford. So let's get a taste of some of the Screwtape letters. And if you've already read the Screwtape letters, oh, I forgot, I've got a couple paragraphs from the address by Dr. Slubgob to the Tempters Banquet at the annual Tempters Training College. I could read that to you a little bit later on if you're interested in it, just a couple of paragraphs. But Here's letter 1, and none of the letters have titles, so I gave them all titles. And this first letter is about jargon. I think you'll see that it's really quite relevant to the day and age in which we live and how the media tends to focus on people's feelings and cliches and talking points rather than substantive conversation. So Screwtape says, I note what you were saying about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? See, John is not a Christian at this point. It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as a result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Lewis was not a fan of the newspaper. And you say, newspaper, what's that? Well, okay, things have changed dramatically since his day, but he did read the newspaper early in life, but then he gave up on it because he didn't have a lot of trust in the media. 1930s and 40s England. Your man has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't use your brain. Just use cliches, jargon, language, words that can be twisted in a dozen different directions, and that's kind of what Lewis is saying through Screwtape in letter number 1. Any thoughts on that? Reaction? Does that sound like modern Canadian culture? Well, okay. See a few heads nodding, but nobody wants to dive in on that one. Well, let's go to letter number 9, what I call exploiting the trough. What people go through hills and valleys and an emotional roller coaster at times. So Screwtape says it is also to be noted that the trough sexuality is subtly different in quality from that of the peak, much less likely to lead to the milk and water phenomenon, which the humans call being in love, much more easily drawn into perversions. So the depths are better for temptation than the heights. Much less contaminated by those generous and imaginative and even spiritual concomitants which often render human sexuality so disappointing. It is the same with other desires of the flesh. You are much more likely to make your man a sound drunkard by pressing drink on him as an anodyne. That's a fancy word for a drug. Lewis just throws these words out. I had to look it up in a dictionary. He throws these words out there as though we all knew what he meant by them. And there's another place where he says good writing, in good writing it's better to use a simple, clear word than a difficult word. But obviously he thought anodyne was a simple, clear word, and maybe for him it was. Same thing with his use of foreign language phrases. He throws Greek and Latin and German and Italian into his prose writings as though we all knew what he was referring to when we mentioned this or that. So I digress in the middle of a sentence. You're much more likely to make your man a sound drunkard by pressing drink on him when he is dull and weary than by encouraging him to use it as a means of merriment among his friends when he is happy and expansive. So when he's down in the dumps and dull and weary, you get a better chance of tempting him than when he's at his best. And this is because of the nature of pleasure, which I find is really brilliant. And this last paragraph or section from letter 9. Never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure, All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced at times or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden. I remember reading that for the first time and thinking, well, I've always thought pleasure was, a place of sin and temptation and easily led astray. And then he sort of set me straight that pleasure is a gift of God. It's God's invention. And if you ever want to have a sort of in the midst of an experience, read about pleasure, pick up Lewis's second book in the Ransom trilogy that I talked about in the spring, Perelandra, where he talks about pleasure and paints it in a very positive light in an unfallen world called Perelandra, which is his old solar term for the planet Venus. So pleasure is a good thing. Distorted pleasure, overdone pleasure, pleasure experienced at the wrong time, although there are ways in which Satan distorts good things to make something bad, and that's why pleasure sometimes gets a bad rap from some of us. So it's okay to enjoy yourself. It's okay to be a Christian and wear a smile on your face, for instance. Let's go to letter 31. This is the letter. This isn't in slides, and we're doing well on time because partly because you're letting me just talk and talk and talk and talk, and nobody's engaging me or challenging me or asking questions or there are a few heads nodding and a few smiles. But this is how letter 31, the last letter, because the patient has died in a bombing raid in London, and so he died, and he died a Christian. And Screwtape is not happy with Wormwood because he let this guy get away. My very dear Wormwood, my poppet, my pig's knee. How mistakenly, now that all is lost, you come whimpering to ask me whether the terms of affection in which I address you meant nothing from the beginning. Far from it. Rest assured, my love for you and your love for me are as like as two peas. I've always desired you, you pitiful fool, as you, pitiful fool, desired me. The difference is that I am the stronger. I think they will give you to me now, or a bit of you. Love you? Why, yes, as dainty a morsel as ever I grew fat on. You have let a soul slip through your fingers. The howl of sharpened famine for that loss re-echoes at this moment through all the levels of the kingdom of noise. Remember, that's hell. Down to the very throne itself, which would mean the throne that Satan sits on is the farthest down. It makes me mad to think of it, how well I know what happened at the instant that when they snatched him from you. There was a sudden clearing of his eyes as he saw you for the first time and recognized the part you had had in him and knew that you had it no longer. Well, and then he goes on. This is another section from letter 31 that I titled Wormwood's Demise. So he failed in his task, and now Screwtape is going to come after him. And I guess in Lewis's way of thinking, Wormwood can become a dish for Screwtape to dine on because he failed in his first assignment on Earth. And so Screwtape says the more one thinks about it, the worse it becomes. He got through so easily. No gradual misgivings, no doctor's sentence, no nursing home, no operating theater, no false hopes of life, sheer instantaneous liberation. He died in a bomb. One moment it seemed to be all our world, the scream of bombs, the fall of houses, the stink and taste of high explosive on the lips and in the lungs, the feet burning with weariness, the heart cold with horrors, the brain reeling, the legs aching. Next moment, all this was gone. Gone like a bad dream, never again to be of any account. Defeated, outmaneuvered fool. I'm getting into this a little bit too much, aren't I? Did you mark how naturally, as if he's been born for it, the earth-born vermin entered the new life, how all his doubts became in the twinkling of an eye ridiculous. I know what the creature was saying to itself. Yes, of course, it was always like this. All horrors have followed the same course, getting worse and worse and forcing you into a kind of bottleneck till, at the very moment when you thought you must be crushed, behold, you are out of the narrows and all was suddenly well. The extraction hurt more and more, and then the tooth was out. The dream became a nightmare, and then you woke, you die, and then you are beyond death. How could I ever have doubted it, is what the patient is thinking. Now, just pause here for a moment and just imagine you're back in school, high school, college, elementary school, whatever, and your teacher has just given you a writing assignment, a creative writing assignment to describe hell, to describe heaven and make it come from the mouth of a demon, but describe it in such a way that you love the picture that is described. How do you do that? Well, that's what Lewis did. And so enjoy. I hope you enjoy how Lewis describes heaven as Screwtape tells Wormwood what happened when his patient John died. As he saw you, he also saw them. I know how it was. You reeled back dizzy and blinded, more hurt by them than he had ever been by bombs. The degradation of it, that this thing of earth and slime could stand upright and converse with spirits before whom you, a spirit, could only cower. Well, there's more to it than that. I cut it short. I didn't quote the letter completely, but I quoted enough of it to assure you that the way Lewis describes heaven in the mouth of Wormwood is absolutely fabulous. So a few reactions to the book when it came out, some much later and some in the mid to late 1940s. David Foster Wallace's 2006 book, The Top 10, names The Screwtape Letters as the greatest novel in history. Well, I think I'd disagree with that, but because it's not really a novel, it's a collection of letters, and they're imaginative letters. They're not really a novel. There's very little in the way of a story form, which is why I wrote that plot behind the letters to help make a little bit more sense out of it if you're into that. But in 1942, shortly after the book came out, Times Literary Supplement out of London, in so readable a fashion Mr. Lewis has contrived to say much that a distracted world greatly requires to hear. The Manchester Guardian, same time, and it came out in February 1942, so these reviewers must have gotten pre-publication copies of the Screwtape Letters and able to read it and then write their reviews. The book is sparkling, yet truly reverent, in fact, a perfect joy, and should become a classic. It did. The Guardian, a month later, Lewis is in earnest with his belief in devils. I guess there was some skepticism that there is such a thing as a devil. That seems to be a modern, trendy thing, that the devil is simply an excuse that modern people of the world use to excuse their behavior and blame it on somebody else instead of taking responsibility for it themselves. But almost like the author thinks a bit incredible that Lewis really believes in devils, but it's a little bit veiled there. And as anxious to unmask their strategy against souls as our intelligence department to detect the designs of Hitler. Halfway through World War II. The war began in 1939, ended in 1945, so we're halfway through the war. The Hibbert Journal, 1942, July. It is to be hoped that neither Mr. Lewis's book nor the Hibbert Journal containing this review will find its way into those regions to apprise the infernal authorities of their mistake. Okay, smile a little bit there. C.E.M. Joad was an atheist, grew up in a Church of England family early in life, abandoned his faith in his college years, became an atheist, a socialist, and then in the late 30s, especially after the war began and the Nazi atrocities began to become more widely known, Joad began to realize that he had sold short the idea that there is evil in the world. He was a person who was a professional philosopher. He thought that the world needed more education, and we would develop our lives past this petty kind of squabbling. And then he came face to face with the reality of Hitler's Germany and the Nazi Holocaust against the Jewish people. And then he also got caught riding a train without having paid for a ticket. It wasn't so bad, except that he had previously bragged in print that he cheats the railway companies whenever he gets a chance to. So they knew about his way of behaving on the trains. He got caught, he got kicked off of a radio program that he was on regularly, and because of that experience, he began to realize that evil is not just out there, not just in Adolf Hitler and his leaders, but evil is in here. And so he read some of Lewis's works, and as near as I was able to tell, he became a Christian ultimately by the work of the Holy Spirit, by the power of the Holy Spirit, but in part through the influence of the writings of C.S. Lewis. And then he wrote a book towards the end of his life in the early 50s about his return to faith, rejoined the Church of England, and died of cancer a year or so after the book was published. Anyway, this is C.E.M. Joad publishing his review of the Screwtape Letters at a time when he's starting to rethink his atheistic worldview. He says, Mr. Lewis possesses the rare gift of being able to make righteousness readable and has produced a pretty piece of homily lit by flashes of insight. You know, we who claim to be theologians usually make one mistake or the other. We get so deep and plodding in our very, very theologically correct and precise description of biblical doctrine that nobody understands it, or we get so light and breezy with our attempt to communicate to the modern world that there's little substance to it, and not too many people are really good at being able to land right smack dab in the middle between the highly intellectual, pedantic sort of prose and the sort of simplistic descriptions of biblical theology. Anyway, that's Joad at a time when he's still ostensibly an atheist. He wrote a book called God and Evil that he debated with Lewis at the Oxford Socratic Club in the mid-1940s. I think it was after this review, and was pretty well treated. I think Lewis had let people know that this guy is a searcher. He's finding his way, so let's not rip him apart. And later on, he became a believer again. Charles Williams, one of Lewis's really good friends, who was also a editor with Oxford University Press, an editor that actually had his offices originally in Oxford and in London, and moved to Oxford during the war because London was facing the Nazi Blitz, and it was dangerous to be in London during Germany's attempt to bring England to its knees by destroying the city of London. And it is true, by the way, that a lot of families sent their kids away from the city of London out into the countryside to live with many a family where they'd be safe from the Nazi bombing. And that became the sort of the origin of Lewis's plot in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where these four children end up going to a big house in the country with some learned older professor and have their adventures of Narnia start there. Anyway, Charles Williams, the Dublin Review. I allow that Mr. Lewis's Screwtape is highly intelligent, almost too intelligent for a devil everywhere except in the center. One of the pleasantest things in the book is his failure there, his incapacity to understand what the enemy is really up to. There are a couple of places in the book where the whole idea of grace or love, expecting nothing in return, is just unfathomable on Screwtape's part. I just don't get it. He doesn't get anything out of this. He just loves freely, and that's a waste of time. Why would you do that? And he just doesn't get it, which is what Williams is echoing. Charles Williams also wrote for Time and Tide, and he said, "My dearest Scorpuscle." That's how he begins. He concludes with the final paragraph. "It is a dangerous book, heavenly dangerous. I hate it, this giveaway of hell." He signs the review, "Your sincere friend, Snigsozzle." And he adds this postscript, "You will send someone to see after Lewis, some very clever fiend." So, yeah, Williams had a sense of humor too, and he was one of the inklings. So Lewis and his brother Warren Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, a bunch of others, some of whom were in those pictures of the walking tours that Lewis would take with his friends, especially in the 1930s. The New Yorker, "If wit and wisdom, style and scholarship are requisites to passage through the pearly gates, Mr. Lewis will be among the angels." Well, okay, the New Yorker you don't become an angel when you die and go to heaven. That's bad theology, but what do you expect from the New Yorker? And you don't get through the pearly gates by having a sufficient amount of wit, wisdom, style, and scholarship. Like you work your way there, and certainly Lewis has done as much as anybody, so if anybody's going to make it, he will. Well, we can criticize that theology, but at least they are being kind of clever in the way that they positively review Lewis's Screwtape letters. Leonard Bacon, last quotation, last review, 1943, so a year after its release, "This admirable, diverting, and remarkably original work. There is a spectacular and satisfactory nova in the bleak sky of satire." Also says, "Whatever you may think of the theses of Mr. Lewis, presented as they are in a bizarre and slantindicular is that a word? Manner, the fact remains that there is a spectacular and satisfactory nova in the bleak sky of satire," which is, of course, Lewis's Screwtape letters. So that is Screwtape letters. So we are done a little bit early. Time for some questions or comments, or first 3 paragraphs of Dr. Slubgob's address at the Tempters Training College. What's your pleasure? Comments, questions? Okay. And for those of you that have Screwtape letters but don't have a version that has this included, here's how it starts. So this will take me 2 minutes to read. "Mr. Principal, your eminence, your disgraces, my thorns, shadies, and gentle devils. It is customary on these occasions for the speaker to address himself chiefly to those among you who have just graduated and who will very soon be posted to official tempterships on earth. It is a custom I willingly obey. I well remember with what trepidation I awaited my own first appointment. I hope and believe that each one of you has the same uneasiness tonight. Your career is before you. Hell expects and demands that it should be, as mine was, one of unbroken success. If it is not, you know what awaits you. If he was wearing glasses, he probably did this, right? Your dreaded principal has included in a speech full of points something like an apology for the banquet which he has set before us. Well, gentle devil, no one blames him, but it would be vain to deny that the human souls on whose anguish we have been feasting tonight were of pretty poor quality. Not all the most skillful cookery of our tormentors could make them better than insipid. Oh, to get one's teeth again into a Farinata, a Henry VIII, or even a Hitler. There was a real crackling there, something to crunch, a rage, an egotism, a cruelty only just less robust than our own. It put up a delicious resistance to being devoured. It warmed your inwards when you'd got it down." And then he goes on from there, so that gives you a little bit of a taste. Maybe not the best preaching material to cite Dr. Slubgob's address in your next sermon, but hey, there are better preachers than I that could do something creative with that. Okay, well then I guess we'll take a break. We'll start a little bit early and we'll come back together for a brief look at Lewis's single most influential work in all of his writings, the book Mere Christianity. Okay, let's take a break. There it is. Okay. So as I said, Walter Hooper was Lewis's private secretary for a month or two during the last year of Lewis's life, and is the person largely responsible for many of the poems and essays of Lewis being brought to publication, including that little book now translated into Chinese, On Stories, that is a collection of Lewis's essays about how to write stories for kids, for adults. So Walter Hooper's apartment had this bust of Lewis in it, and we were privileged to be there during a sabbatical I was privileged to enjoy in Oxford back in 2004. So it's been a while since I was there, but that photo I took in Walter's apartment one evening as he was welcoming a bunch of friends to the dedication of his apartment to the glory of God. So his top three works, the one that we just looked at, The Chronicles of Narnia, the series that I did 7 years ago. I'm going to guess none of you were at that one, but it's probably still, you were? Oh, wow, okay, fantastic. Probably still on Seminary's YouTube channel. And then this one that we're going to take a look at this evening in the second hour, Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity has, I haven't checked this lately, but has been in the Bookscan Religion bestsellers list for 513 weeks in a row. The list was created in 2001, and it was still there 9 years later. Worldview Institute put Mere Christianity #1 in its top 100 Christian books. The Problem of Pain by Lewis, #4. Screwtape Letters, #11. Reflections on the Psalms, #20. Another one, 30, 31, 32. Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, #47. And The Weight of Glory and Other Addresses, #94. Along with books by people whose names, some of whom you've heard of: John Piper, Timothy Keller, G.K. Chesterton, Jean Edward Veith, Martin Luther. Anybody ever heard of him? Yeah, I think maybe. Okay, John Calvin and many other authors. So that's a prestigious group of authors that are there in that top 100 Christian books, at least at the time that this group put this list together. Mere Christianity is also #1 in Christianity Today's Books of the Century, the same list that includes the Chronicles of Narnia. And if we were to come up with influential Christian books by various organizations, it would probably be among the top 10, certainly in the top 25 or 50 of almost every list that's put together by conservative, liberal, and every theological position in between. Occasionally I put pictures that you might have seen one of these pictures before, but this is the desk that Lewis wrote at, and it is now located in the Wade Center in Wheaton, Illinois. The world's finest collection of books by and about C.S. Lewis. This is the Wade Center on the campus of Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. If you look closely, you might see a lamppost in honor of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and how that story kind of begins. Let's talk about the term Mere Christianity, because it sounds like almost a put down to Christianity. Mere Christianity, there's nothing much to that. Well, it goes back 400 years, the origin of the term, to an Anglican theologian by the name of Richard Baxter. You see his birth and death years there. And this is a paraphrase or summary of what Lewis means by the term Mere Christianity. The essential Christian message as espoused historically by Catholics and Protestants alike. You'll see that a little bit later on when I talk about the topics that Lewis does not address. He was a chaplain in one of Cromwell's regiments and an earlier chaplain to Charles II, became a nonconformist minister, hymnist, and author. And so that's Richard Baxter, influential individual, also called the theological core on which Christian traditions can agree. So he avoids controversial topics. The Common Doctrines of Christianity, probably the simplest and easiest definition of mere Christianity, or The Basic Form and Beliefs of Christianity that all traditions and denominations accept. And probably a few exceptions to that some would disagree with one or another of Lewis's chapters in the book. So the influence of the book in a 1993 Christianity Today poll, this book was listed as the single most influential Christian book for Christians other than the Bible. I think you'll understand why the Bible ranks number one, right? So this is a 1993 Christianity Today poll. The 50th anniversary of the book was in 2002. So at least 11 million copies have been sold, and like I said, probably a lot more than that because publishers don't release how many copies of their books have been sold. Translated into at least 6 languages. This isn't one of them, but I'll show you the cover of a Chinese version of Mere Christianity, which I also have in my library, but not here because it's back in my Austin home. So any book that gets translated into another language has to be an influential book, and this one's been translated into a bunch, at least 6, probably more by this time. John Stott's Basic Christianity recommends Mere Christianity as the first good Christian book that you ought to read. John Stott, a famous Anglican theologian who was widely revered in evangelical circles and a pretty prolific author and a proponent of the missionary task of the church. D.L.W. Hudson, who was a Catholic, called it in a 1997 article called Books That Made Me Catholic. Mere Christianity was one of those. It's the most frequently mentioned book that influenced members of the Evangelical Theological Society and the Wesleyan Theological Society, even though Lewis was neither an evangelical or a Wesleyan. Incredible Ink is a book in my library back in Texas. Lewis is the top author, and Mere Christianity is the top book that Scott Larson lists. He asked a lot of leaders of the Christian church all across North America what were the most influential books for you that helped to shape you into the person you are today. And this book and Lewis as an author were named more frequently than any other book or author, and a lot of the books that were named, other authors would be recognizable names to you. Now I'm a little bit dated here, but Chuck Colson, a lawyer in the Richard Nixon presidency, and Thomas Monahan, the founder of Domino's Pizza, both trace their conversion to Christianity to reading this book. There's my Chinese copy of Mere Christianity, or at least the cover of it. I got the whole book back there, and I've read exactly the same amount of that book as I have these two right here. Now, occasionally, I've been privileged to be in Oxford or Cambridge at a time, a clear day, beautiful sky, wonderful landscape, and one of the better photos that I ever took, and this is a picture of the tower of Magdalen College where Lewis taught for 29 years. And one of the 4 major music schools of Oxford University, and a place where he was hired as an English professor in 1925. So what are the characteristics of Mere Christianity? In other words, why should you read it? It's a book of apologetics, not in the sense of, I'm so sorry I have to apologize. Not that kind of apology, but in the sense, the Greek word apologia means defense. So he's defending the Christian faith, and that's what he saw his role in life, not only to defend it, but also to proclaim it and to help people understand the Christian faith in common people's language, hence my subtitle, Uncommon Truth in Common Language. I think even though Lewis would be horrified to hear me say this, he's not around to object. It reflects his personality in some ways because it's rational, it's ordered, it's sequential, logical, but it also is very imaginative, and I'll give you an example or two of how that is the case, but later on. So it is autobiographical, it reflects his life. In fact, I think as you start reading the initial chapters and he's trying to explained how the Christian faith and its message of sin and grace and guilt and forgiveness makes sense. I think he's talking about how he came to faith and first came to the realization that if he didn't think there was such a thing as right and wrong, why was he upset when somebody got to the seat on the bus before he did? Why was he upset with that? If there's no right and wrong, the guy couldn't possibly have done anything wrong. He just got there first, and you shouldn't be upset about it. But the fact that he's upset suggests that there is a certain standard of moral behavior, and it suggests to him that if a guy got there first, he understands that that's legitimate for him to take that place. But if he tricked me and snuck in there while my back was turned, I get upset about that, but not the first one. Why is there this difference? It's because there is an objective standard of right and wrong that we have violated, and Lewis is aware of that, so he's telling us a little bit. I think, this is just a guess, but I think he's describing the mental path that he walked as he moved from atheism to Christianity. This is actually wrong. I since learned, since I wrote this sentence, that his voice wasn't the second most well-known voice in England during World War II. First voice would be, anybody want to guess? Winston Churchill, yeah. Because somebody did a study of the size of the listening audiences of various radio speakers during World War II, and Lewis's audiences were, I don't know, 5th or 6th or 7th or somewhere like that. So he didn't rank number 2 behind Winston Churchill, but still a lot more people that have ever listened to me the few times I've been on the radio, I can tell you that, probably in the millions. His book contains a lot of battlefield language, which I'll illustrate a little bit later on. It's most of the book was originally delivered over the radio on the BBC, and in spite of the fact that he did not like the radio, he detested the radio, like he detested newspapers, nevertheless he agreed to do these talks over the radio because he thought it might help the morale of the British people during the Second World War. So what does he not cover? So we think about this term, mere Christianity, the common core of the Christian faith, and you can object to any of these. Like this first one you might object to. He doesn't get into baptism and the Lord's Supper, not because it's peripheral teaching, but because there is so much disagreement over the meaning and the purpose and the function of these sacraments that he decided to steer clear of that. Doesn't talk about the Virgin Mary, doesn't get into some of the Catholic uniquenesses like whether the Pope is the vicar of Christ. He doesn't get into this issue during wartime that he gave these talks initially, so he doesn't want to offend people, although he himself served in the military. He wanted to support the military. Some of you saw before we got started the first hour picture of him getting his picture taken with RAF pilots in 1944, which illustrates the fact that he did support the war effort. So he would come down firmly on the side of military service when needed and was not a pacifist. But he doesn't get into that in the book. He doesn't talk about different hermeneutics or different approaches to understanding the Scripture. He doesn't get into eschatology. That's a wise decision right there, right? Because there are all kinds of opinions about that, especially when you get to the books of Daniel and Revelation. Doesn't talk about marriage and remarriage after divorce or not. Doesn't talk about creation, evolution, Genesis, and science on origins. Doesn't discuss this either. Those who have never heard of Christ, are they lost? Are they capable of salvation? Doesn't get into birth control. Doesn't get into baptism in the Holy Spirit, the charismatic movement, spiritual gifts movement, even though we all believe in spiritual gifts, but how they are used in some circles. He doesn't get into those sort of Pentecostal applications of the gifts. Doesn't talk about the 7 ecumenical councils, the spiritual authority of the local congregation, which is kind of how Lutherans are, or higher ecclesiastical jurisdictions like Catholics and Protestants are more top-down, more hierarchical, and LCC is much more congregational based. He steers clear of worship and music, and they say that the three most controversial things in the Lutheran Church today are wine, women, and song. Wine, the Lord's Supper, role of women in the church, and music and worship. So I guess that's true. And so he avoided those topics. And he has some opinions that he expresses elsewhere, but not here. So as I said, this was a series of BBC broadcasts during the Second World War, and I read the Mere Christianity once looking for every single word that Lewis uses in the book that is an echo of the war that's going on as he writes. As he writes most of these chapters. What you have as a handout is a list of all the chapters. Let me just grab one of those. The date they were given over the BBC, and if Lewis later on wrote a chapter for the publication of Mere Christianity. So you've got this series in September 1941, another one in 1942, third one in 42, and then another one in 44. Combined all those series, plus added certain chapters like the cardinal virtues in the third series, charity and hope in the third series. Those were added later on in order to produce Mere Christianity, a 1952 publication. So words from the battlefield, just to illustrate this. My copy of Mere Christianity, I think, is 236 pages. So there's more than one battlefield type word per page in this book, which makes sense because he understands writing, he understands the audience to whom he's writing or speaking in the case of those topics that were originally spoken and read in manuscript form over the BBC. So here are just a few examples of it, and I list in the case of those that are used frequently, like the word war appears 80 times in the book. I bet if you had told me that after I'd read the book for the first time, did you know the word war appears 80 times in that book, I would have said, you're kidding. Because it just seems so natural in the context. But it makes an awful lot of sense to use this kind of military language written during the Second World War by a veteran of World War I and by a man who is aware of the fact that there are physical wars that are going on, and including in our world today, but there's also a spiritual war that's taking place that's really more serious than the fighting that's going on in Israel and Gaza and Lebanon, as well as in parts of Africa and other parts of the world. Another break for you. This is the building that Lewis had his rooms in. It was called New Building, and it was built in 1733, which is why it's called New Building. Well, okay, maybe they should have changed the name by this time, but in 1733 and 34 it was new, and I guess the name just stuck, and Oxford is great on tradition. Go to the Oxford and you see the Bodleian Library, and it's got 5 levels of architecture, and every level is a different type of architecture. But I think it's kind of beautiful, in spite of the fact that it's not consistent and perfectly aligned with every other type of architecture there. But this is a new building, and his rooms were kind of right in the middle on the second floor. So let's take a look at Series 1 and how he got invited to speak over the BBC. So Dr. James Welch, Director of Religious Broadcasting for the BBC, wrote to Lewis with an invitation to speak. He suggested a couple topics, such as modern literature, in a letter to Lewis in February 1941. Welch knew about him because he had read Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, which is a 1940 publication. So Welch, Director of Religious Broadcasting, did a lot of reading in the field and was looking for people that could speak over the BBC. So Lewis wrote The Problem of Pain because someone else had read his book, The Pilgrim's Regress, from a decade earlier, liked it, and so he's invited to write The Problem of Pain. So Lewis writes back to Welch. So there's The Problem of Pain is his 1940 book. Lewis, as I said earlier, detested the radio, but he realized that he could reach a lot of people with the truth of God through the radio, and so he accepted the invitation. Nice guy. He wrote back to Welch, who had written to him in February 7. 3 days later, he says, I think what I mainly want to talk about is the law of nature, or objective right and wrong. It seems to me that the New Testament, by preaching repentance and forgiveness, always assumes an audience who already believe in the law of nature and know that they have disobeyed it. In modern England, we cannot at present assume this, and therefore most apologetic begins a stage too far on. The first step is to create or recover the sense of guilt. So what would you say about Canada today? Is there a sense of guilt that the typical Canadian citizen is aware that there is a God, I'm accountable to him, and I haven't lived up to his standards? Yeah. What do you think? Not a lot. I mean, there are some, and maybe one of the keys of reaching people of that sort is to put them in touch with some of the kinds of things that they think are morally wrong. Maybe they're a climate change activist and they think it's morally wrong to drive an internal combustion engine, but they have a sense of right and wrong. It's just that their criteria are a little bit different, maybe a lot different from what the Bible has to say. But the idea that I am a sinner and I need forgiveness, that's not all that widely accepted. So Lewis wants to create an awareness of our sin without using the term sin. Okay? So Lewis was engaged for 4 15-minute talks. He got asked, I know it says 5 talks there, but he got so many letters of response to his first couple of talks that the BBC asked him to do another one to answer some of the questions from these listeners. So the dates are there. You see them also on the handout. And this is the title of the first series, Right and Wrong, A Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. It was a great success. Lewis was known for having a rich voice, educated, earthy, full of vitality. And his 5th talk, which got moved to, I think, 2nd or 3rd position. Oh, I guess it's chapter 2. Now, it was the 5th talk, right-hand column, but it's chapter 2 in the book in answer to some of those questions that came in after the first essay. So he gave a first talk. He gave a 5th talk, but more letters than ever arrived, and so from this point on, he receives a lot of correspondence for the rest of his life. So even though he didn't mean to help the war effort so much, but it did help the war effort a great deal. He says, some object to my use of the word Christian to being one who accepts the common doctrines of Christianity. That was one of the objections. He used the word Christian. That shouldn't refer to a person who accepts the common doctrines of Christianity. I'm sort of puzzled by that, but I guess that would have been written by someone who thought that the word Christian meant a good person, a nice person, not necessarily somebody who believes a certain set of ideas that are found originally in Scripture. So one of the objections came from Mr. W.R. Child from Leeds. He insisted that the moral teaching of Christ is the most important thing in Christianity and linked Lewis with religious bigots. He said, if I tell Mr. Lewis that feeling the presence of God in flowers and music is eternal life, he may prepare his faggots for the usual heresy hunt in which Christian dogmatists have in the past so often liberated their own suppressed intellects and passions. Did he touch a nerve maybe for this poor guy? So Lewis challenged his accuser to find any passage in his works which favors religious or anti-religious compulsion. For that discovery, Lewis pledged £5 to any not militantly anti-Christian charity named by Child. Now, what would 5 pounds British sterling in 1941 be worth in today's money? You could probably look it up on your phone and figure it out, but I bet it's over 100 Canadian dollars. So he's offering to contribute probably a good deal more than that. I don't know. Somebody's going to look it up now and tell me, I hope. So the next week, Mr. Child absolved Lewis from the charge of preparing literal faggots. He suggested that the effect of Mr. Lewis's propaganda is to isolate Christianity in a theological vacuum, and he neglected to specify his favorite charity because, of course, he could not point to any piece of Lewis's writings, any word, any phrase, any sentence that favored religious or anti-religious compulsion. Okay, well, that's series one. Very, very powerful series of essays that were published separately and sold out of copies as a result. So series two. BBC asked him to do another series because the first series was popular, called What Christians Believe. The two series were published together under the title Broadcast Talks. How's that for a clever title of a book? He gives about 10 broadcast talks and he calls the book Broadcast Talks. Wow, this is so clever. So the request to do a second series arrived before the first series was over. The response was so positive. Each was to be 15 minutes. Lewis agreed, scheduled for January and February. After reading the scripts, Eric Fenn, who was James Welch's assistant, wrote to Lewis on December 5. He said, I have at last had time to read your scripts. I think they are quite first class. Indeed, I don't know when I have read anything in the same class at all. There is a clarity and inexorableness about them which made me positively gasp. Whew. Well, okay, that's pretty high praise. I don't know when I have read anything in the same class at all. So these talks were also given live. Lewis started with these words that were later cut out of the published work. He said, it's not because I'm anybody in particular that I've been asked to tell you what Christians believe. In fact, it's just the opposite. They've asked me, first of all, because I'm a layman and not a parson, and consequently it was thought I might understand the ordinary person's point of view a bit better. Secondly, I think they asked me because it was known that I'd been an atheist for many years and only became a Christian quite fairly recently. So he said this over the radio, but it didn't end up in the book. They thought that would mean I'd be able to see the difficulties, able to remember what Christianity looks like from the outside. So you see, the long and the short of it is that I've been selected for this job just because I'm an amateur, not a professional, and a beginner, not an old hand. Of course, this means that you may well ask what right I have to talk on the subject at all. Well, he writes, when I'd finished my scripts, I sent them around to various people who were professionals. To one Church of England theologian, one Roman Catholic, one Presbyterian, and one Methodist. The Church of England man and the Presbyterian agreed with the whole thing. The Roman Catholic and the Methodist agreed in the main, but would have liked one or two places altered. So there you've got all the cards on the table. Well, one reason for that is because there aren't many Lutherans in England, and probably some other reasons why there aren't that many Lutherans in England. Baby Lutheranism is so similar to Anglicanism that people can't tell the difference, and the Anglican Church is sort of the established church. So anyway, he goes on to say in this section that didn't make it into the printed version, what I'm going to say isn't exactly what all these people would say, these four theologians, but the greater part of it is what all Christians agree on. And the main reason why I couldn't alter it so as to make them agree completely was that I've got only 15 minutes for each talk. That doesn't give you time to make many subtle distinctions. You've got to go at it rather like a bull in a china shop or you won't get through. One thing I can promise you, in spite of all the unfortunate differences between Christians, what they agree on is still something pretty big and pretty solid, big enough to blow any of us sky high if it happens to be true. And if it's true, it's quite ridiculous to put off doing anything about it simply because Christians don't agree among themselves. That's pretty smart on his part. He's doing some pre-evangelism there, because that's sometimes what an unbeliever says. Well, there's so many different denominations. How can I know which one is right? They're probably all wrong. They just have different versions of the same thing, and they use that as an excuse not to really look seriously at the claims of Christ. He says that's as if a man bleeding to death refused medical assistance because he's heard that some doctors differed about the treatment of cancer. For if Christianity is true at all, it's as serious as that. Well, here goes. Well, okay, so Lewis, a good talker, a sharp mind, and yeah, sad to say no Lutherans among the four. He did know a few Lutherans. Had a few friends from Germany in particular, some of whom made their way to Oxford during the war for safety reasons. So who are the four clergymen? These names may not mean anything to you. Probably Austin Farrer, who was a chaplain at one of the Oxford University colleges. Dombey Griffiths, Roman Catholic friend and adult convert to Christianity. He was a student of Lewis in English language and literature in the 1920s, and they were both claiming atheism at that time, but they were both open and were searching and looking for a way out, and both became Christians about the same time. And I tell that story in my book, From Atheism to Christianity, which came out from CPH in 2017. Definitely, because he identifies this guy somewhere, Joseph Dowell, an RAF Padre, a Methodist. So remember the connection to the RAF and how Lewis would lecture with them. He undoubtedly collaborated with Dowell on some of the weekend retreats for the RAF pilots. And then the guy at the BBC that I mentioned earlier, Eric Fenn, who was James Welch's sidekick. Now this is where, because we can't make the sound work real well, I'm just going to commend this to you and show you the page on another screen. I'll just get rid of this, but for now I just want you to know that the link to this video that I would show you if we had good audio that could also be heard by the online audience. All we can do is make it the sound on my laptop, which isn't a really robust sound and wouldn't be heard online. You can also simply go to YouTube and just search for C.S. Lewis doodles. And there are a couple of people, an artist and a narrator, who have taken different chapters of Lewis's book and have narrated the book while this artist depicts in pictorial form what Lewis is saying in this chapter. This, I would have shown you this one. Oh, this is the wrong one. The one I was going to show was The Shocking Alternative. This is the next one that's queued up when you watch The Shocking Alternative, which is the chapter in the book that Lewis is most famous for. It's where he says, you got to make up your mind. Either he's a liar or a lunatic or Lord. Make your choice. And I think the chapter comes alive more powerfully when you see it visualized as well as hear it read. But this is another one of the chapters, so you can use a lot of these, I guess. I don't know how many of them, 15 or 20 of the chapters at least, have had a C.S. Lewis doodle created to visualize what Lewis argues and states in this book. So we won't go there because the audio will not be any good. Let's get on to move towards the conclusion. Series 3, 8 talks, practical advice. He calls it Christian behavior. 8 talks, there are the dates that he gave them. He thought they were supposed to be 15 minutes each, but Fenn wanted them to be 10 minutes. So Lewis cut them down, and later on restored them for publication in a little book called Christian Behavior. So you got broadcast talks, then you got Christian Behavior, and then eventually the last set is published and all of them come together. The fourth series, Lewis writes a letter in 1943 in response to Eric Fenn. It's called Beyond Personality. Eric Fenn wrote to Lewis on, this is June 16 when Lewis responds. Eric Fenn wrote on June 11. Have you thought any further about this series of more theological talks you were inclined to when I last saw you? We have been considering lately a suggestion made at an informal conference on religious broadcasting, which we held recently, namely the need for a series of talks which would take some of the more abstruse theological doctrines and show the sort of difference they make both to thought and conduct. So Lewis writes back and says, yes, I should like to give the sort of series you suggest, something of this sort. Doctrine of the Trinity, 1 session, 2 sessions, something on creation. I guess he would be violating his own rule, but he never did write a chapter on creation. The incarnation, the 2 natures of Christ. But some of this stuff is difficult to understand, right? So he was going to grab a hold of these more, what does he, Fenn say, abstruse theological doctrines. The resurrection, not all that abstruse, but the ascension. He says, not by these titles, perhaps 1 and 2 has got a picture, 3, creation, 4 and 5, the human element in God, 6, the defeat of death, 7, the promotion of man. Would this at all suit? So if you read the book, maybe some of you undoubtedly have read it. Some of you decide, I think I better read that book. You'll run into the word stone. That's a British term for a unit of weight. It's 14 pounds. L is means a mile in British terminology. Do either of those terms get used in Canada? I'm not here long enough to know. Don't use those here.
Stone is an older measurement, but I don't think it's...
Yeah, it's more on the other side of the pond, okay.
I've read it in British books.
Yeah, I read it in British books.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, if a stone is 14 pounds, then, if you weigh 300 pounds and you divide that by 14, it looks like you're a lot lighter than the number of pounds or kilograms or whatever unit you follow. So 7 talks, those are the dates, got it in the handout. There was a little bit of debate over how long they should be. They were 10-minute scripts instead of 15. And Lewis says there's some misunderstanding. Lewis wanted to add to them. He says, I could add to them, but it would probably break the unity of each. Of course, you threatened scrutiny of some of my analogies. The very word has a sinister sound, suggesting Scrooge, screws, Screwtape, scraping, and inland revenue. May lead to at least 600 additional words in some cases, but as you know, I'm very biddable. I'm agreeable. When it comes to the point, you'd better come to dine and spend the night with your Screwtiny, hadn't you? So he sent the revised scripts to Eric Fenn on January 5th, 1944, and then he was told that they were scheduled for 10:20 p.m., and they expected him to do them live. He responded in February, who the devil is going to listen to any at 10:20? If it is possible, but I suppose you'd have anticipated my suggestion if it were, cancel the whole thing for this spring and put it on later in the year. If not, I can't spend any Tuesday nights in town, as a talk at 10:20 means catching the midnight train and getting to bed about 3 o'clock. Well, I'll give 3 under those conditions. The rest you'll have to record. I don't mind which. If you know the address of any reliable firm of assassins, nose slitters, garroters, and poisoners, garroters are those that put an iron collar on someone, I should be grateful to have it. I shall write a book about the BBC. You see if I don't. And then he writes in the letter, grrr. So a couple of his recordings have survived. And if you want to hear what his voice sounded like, you can find them on Google and listen to the voice of Lewis. Really hard to understand because he has a very thick British, Irish accent. But nevertheless, if you idolize Lewis, unlike me, I don't worship him because I don't have a C.S. Lewis cup or a sweatshirt or T-shirt. Actually, I used to have one and I broke it. Bummer. Yeah, okay. But you can hear his voice if you want to. Fenn wrote to Lewis with 2 different reactions of the audience, to which Lewis replied, thanks for the suitable Lenten reading, which I returned. The 2 views you report, cat's whiskers and beneath contempt, really great or not worth spending my time, aren't very illuminating about me, perhaps. About my subject matter, it is an old story, isn't it? they love or hate. This is a photo of Magdalen College Tower. Middle of the picture, right smack dab in the middle, you can see the tower of Magdalen College rising above the horizon just a little bit on a cloud-covered day from the top of St. Mary, the University Church on High Street. Publication schedule. So we talked about broadcast talks were the first and second series of broadcasts. Originally I said the first was published alone, but no, it's first and second. In the U.S., it came through as the Case for Christianity. In the third series, Christian Behavior. Fourth series, Beyond Personality. And then they were all combined, those additional chapters, written as this handout indicates, for the publication of Mere Christianity in 1952. So I have a few reviews like I had for the Screwtape letters, what people thought about it at the time and since then. Since the book was published in 1952, it'll look a little bit strange to have a review in 1942, but this isn't a review of Mere Christianity. This is a review of or response to Lewis's first series of broadcasts, probably first and second series of broadcast talks, given the date of this review in the tablet. We have never read arguments better marshaled and handled so that they can be remembered, or any book more useful to the Christian who finds himself called upon to argue briefly from first premises, to say why morality is not herd instinct, why there is a special and unique character attached to the sense of obligation, why the conviction that there is a law of right and wrong and a transcendent morality is only intelligible if there is a God. Met the Times Literary Supplement earlier. No writer of popular apologetics today is more effective than Mr. C.S. Lewis. The author shows himself a master in the rare art of conveying profound truths in simple and compelling language, and that's why I call it uncommon truth in common language. So I got a couple more slides yet. So what are the lessons that we can learn from reading Mere Christianity about how we speak the Christian faith in our conversations with other people? Speak the language of the person to whom you're witnessing. So Lewis used battlefield language as he's speaking to a British audience that was embroiled in the Second World War. He understood their situation. He drew lessons from the war effort. He talked about the incarnation as a kind of invasion of this earth by an unearthly visitor. Avoid controversial issues. I mean, they might like to get caught up in some issue to distract you from the main thing. And of course, the main thing for us is to keep the main thing, right? I mean, it's only the story of Jesus that's going to bring a person to faith. Whenever you can, use a clear and basic word instead of a complicated word like anodyne.
That's a good one.
Yeah, touche. Lewis would probably say touche on that one, heck. Use stories whenever you can. Lewis was a great storyteller. In fact, I just realized it was a different PowerPoint where I have listed, I should have added that slide to this PowerPoint, where I talk about Mere Christianity as apologetics, because I read one chapter in Mere Christianity looking for and then listing all the analogies that appear in that chapter. And there are about 8 different ways in which Lewis uses a story, a picture, a metaphor, an analogy to convey the truth of what he has to say there. And so Lewis would use, an analogy is kind of like a very brief story, but Lewis also told stories. And of course, the gospel is story, and your personal application of the story, your faith walk is a story also, which is why a personal testimony is effective in communicating, because people want to see the gospel in people's lives and how it has had an impact in you. Sometimes go places and do things for the sake of the gospel, even if you'd rather not be there. Maybe even witnessing to somebody who smokes. Perhaps even give a copy of Mere Christianity to an interested person. I recognize that if that's your the kind of tracts that you hand out to non-believers, it might get really expensive at $20 per tract, but nevertheless, I'd rather give something that can have a powerful impact in a person's life, and that is a very serious and engaging presentation of the Christian faith that can really make a difference than something that might just get tossed if used. And you might even, get yourself a copy to assist you in being prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have, but to do it with gentleness and respect. The end. Last slide. So we have time for a few more questions and answers or comments, and even, are they able to post a question online? Yeah. Are there some? Has anybody said hi? Not yet. Okay, or wanted to ask a question or make a comment? Anybody here? We do have some people tuning in online.
I heard a quote at one point. It was a modern pastor talking, and he said, I don't write highbrow stuff like C.S. Lewis. I try to, write basic, simple things." And the response to that was that Lewis wasn't trying to do that either. He was trying to speak the common language of people. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting to think how definitions have changed.
Describing Lewis's writings as highbrow.
Yeah.
Well, some of Lewis's things were very technical. So when you read something that he writes in the field of English literature, which is his specialty, unless you're also in that field, it's pretty tough to follow. Or if he writes something philosophical, like his book Miracles, which is a defense of the supernatural, basically, or his book The Abolition of Man, which is also fairly philosophical, those are a lot harder to handle. Did I say that next week I'm going to give you a bird's eye view of The Abolition of Man? That's kind of scary, that philosophical work. But I've read the book and talked to some people who've read it and read a lot about it, so I hope to be able to make a case in the first hour for why this book is worth plowing through. And if it's just too difficult, too deep for you, maybe my PowerPoint will be adequate to summarize the 3 sections of that book and help you to see why it's significant, as well as give you an alternative essay that Lewis has written that summarizes the arguments in that book in a much, much briefer form, and I think a little bit more palatable. But it is kind of highbrow. But Lewis was trained in philosophy, was trained in English language and literature, and when he's writing in areas that he has academic training, he can be highbrow, but
as to be expected, but I don't think he's trying to do that with most
No,
of his
he's
projects.
certainly
he's
not.
really trying hard to communicate on a very basic level. So
he has an essay called God in the Dock, where he says that the task of the modern theologian, I would say also the Christian witness, is that of a translator. We need to take concepts that we know and translate them into the language of the common people so that it's language they can understand. That's a bit of a challenge, but it's a worthy challenge to step up to. And the best way to do it, I think, is by getting into the weeds with the people that are outside of the church and talking to them, and especially listening as you get acquainted with them and finding out what their vocabulary is like, what things really interest them, and you learn all kinds of things about how you could possibly share a message of hope with somebody maybe who's looking for some message like that. So enter their world and learn their language. In fact, isn't that kind of what Jesus did? He entered our world and he spoke the language of the people that he was born among and lived among and died and rose again. Well, let's close, shall we? And let's close with a prayer. Lord, for the servant C.S. Lewis that we've been privileged to talk about this evening in the past couple of weeks, we thank you. We thank you for his writings, for the opportunity to learn from him how to communicate the truth of the gospel with people around us. Give us a motivation for that as well as the opportunities to do so. And where we seem to think there are no opportunities that come our way, we pray that you would grant those to us and put us in positions where we have those opportunities, and make us aware of those when those opportunities arrive. Give us the boldness and the gentleness both to speak when that opportunity comes our way. By the power of your Spirit, and in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Thank you all for being here, those online as well as those present here in the room.